Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstensen, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. So welcome back to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. And today I am here with Shannon Western, who is a nutritionist and therapist. She is the founder of Ease Nutrition Therapy, which is a disordered eating non-diet clinic. And Shannon supports all relationships with food so people can feel more comfortable with food, their emotions, and their body. And you can find her on Ease Nutrition Therapy, and I'm going to put a link to that below and to her lovely Instagram account and podcast also. So Shannon, you're really welcome today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. And we had a chat before deciding to record this episode to focus the conversation around hypothalamic amenorrhea, because I know you do a lot of work around that. It's something that I haven't covered on the podcast. And to be honest, I haven't really, I know it shows up in my own clinic and practice, but I don't find myself talking about it maybe as much as I could. And I think it's probably more common, would you say, than what the current discourse is kind of letting on.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was also kind of the same up until a couple of years ago, because I kind of knew it was a thing. So, well, I guess we should maybe clarify. Hypothalamic amenorrhea is really when you lose your menstrual cycle from disordered eating, mostly disordered eating, other reasons, but that's the kind of space I'm working in. So HA is really common. But yeah, like you, I wasn't really necessarily like working with it or telling people like, oh, I can help you with it. It was more like a kind of thing on the side that I was aware of. And then a couple of years ago, for some reason, I just got like an influx of people who had missing periods. And then I got really into it and I realized that really there's not many resources or people working in HA, especially in the UK and Ireland. There's quite a few people in like Australia who are working in HA, but really like not much going on where we live. And yeah, that's kind of how I came to it. And yeah, I think I'm really excited to talk about it because it's a kind of big topic, right? But it's kind of not spoken about too much.
Yeah, and I think for me, because I never really had a big interest in fertility or female hormones or pregnancy or any kind of that realm or any sort of period related things, even though my own personal experience with periods and menstruation has been very challenging at times, but it's just, I don't know, it just wasn't an area even within like health and nutrition that I've sort of seeked out. But then, as you say, like when you are working with people who have a disordered relationship with food or are in recovery from an eating disorder, it is actually quite common. And like, I wonder if we could talk a bit about why like hypothalamic amenorrhea, or HA for short, so that I don't have to get stuck on the word every time. Like, why is it common, in particular in people who are struggling around the relationship with food?
Yeah, well, I should actually say I always forget this part, but I think I'm so into HA because I'm also really into hormone health and fertility and periods. So I've always been really into it, and I worked a lot in women's health when I first started out as a nutritionist. And then I kind of was really into the kind of disordered eating side of things. So I think maybe this is a way of me holding on to that sort of hormonal work that I really like. So I think that's why I'm so into it, actually, now that you mention it. Yeah, so I mean, HA is so common in disordered eating because there's kind of three main causes of HA. There's too little food going in, too much energy expended, so too much exercise, or stress. And all three of those things usually are happening in disordered eating. So, I know that like when we hear HA and missing periods, people might assume, oh, it's only people who are very restrictive who might lose their period. But people lose their period like all types of disordered eating. It's mostly common in people who have a restrictive type of disordered eating. But like I always say, like restrictive eating isn't just one thing. Like someone could technically be binge eating and also restricting.
Yeah.
Because I mean, binge eating is most of the time also restrictive in some way, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's the three main reasons. So too little in, too much energy out, and stress. And when I say stress, I mean like the kind of day-to-day stress, but I also mean like the chronic stress that you can have from having a difficult relationship to food. And
Yeah.
really what happens is there's kind of loads of science behind it, which to be honest, I'm not going to go into because I'm tired. And it's a lot to go into. But basically, your hypothalamus, which is the center in your brain, basically like over time with chronic stress or high levels of disordered eating, too little food intake, lots of exercise, basically the cortisol that fires through your body and acts on your hypothalamus eventually just tells your brain, like, we're not doing this anymore. It's not safe for this person to become pregnant. So it stops your reproductive hormones from giving you that sort of the menstrual cycle every month. So it really acts on your estrogen levels and your progesterone levels, which are just two types of hormones. And so eventually this kind of chronic messaging completely stops your periods. And this is also why, like, sometimes if you're a bit stressed or you go on holiday or you're like, you have a cold, sometimes you can be like a bit late on your period or you can miss it completely, but it's just a one-off, right? But then
Yeah.
if it's chronic and happens long term, this is like an insight that almost like your body is just not feeling safe. And it's like this person cannot become pregnant right now. Like they're not going to be able to grow a pregnancy. They're not going to be able to take care of a baby, right? Like that's ultimately what it is, like this chronic stress response, ultimately,
Yeah.
right? The stress response. And it's very cortisol dominated, which is why one of the main things for HA is to heal your relationship to food and become less stressed, because disordered eating is very stressful, right?
Absolutely. And I think as well, the other thing from my understanding, and thank you for that explanation of the very high level explanation of how the hormones work, is also that it is, if it's chronic under eating and over exercising, which of course puts the body then in a more malnourished state, that even from an energy perspective, it's also a way for the body to conserve energy and use resources where it's more important. So, there isn't, like you said, there's not going to be enough energy to grow and nurture a new human. But also it's like, well, if I don't have that much energy available, periods they cost a lot of energy, and they're like not that they're not necessary for sustaining life for the individual, right? Like having energy for running our brain and our heart and our muscles are like more important than our periods. So that's often why they are the first thing to go when somebody is entering into a stage of malnutrition. Like, would you
Oh yeah,
agree with
exactly.
that? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And that's like such an important point. It's also why like digestion becomes dodgy when you're restricting or engaging in dieting, right? Like it's just not fully necessary, right? Like the body needs energy to move, to beat your heart. Like, yeah, I think actually there's a lot of similarities and links between your menstrual cycle and your digestion. Like often I find in clinic that people who are missing a period also tend to have really difficult digestive problems because they kind of intersect, like, because cortisol and like stress are very dominant in both. Like, so if someone experiences, let's say, like a lot of bloating or a lot of constipation, they also like are experiencing a lot of stress, right? So I think there's like a big intersection between both, and people, if they're missing a period, they probably have some sort of gut issue as well. In my experience, that's quite common.
That's really interesting. I hadn't actually thought about it like that, but that makes sense. And I know also sometimes that when you do have your periods around that time of when you're bleeding, that can have an effect even on your gut motility and things like that. So there's definitely interesting intersections around that. And then the
Yeah.
other question, I think, because I've had clients who had their periods been missing for years, and often due to long-term chronic undereating or having a restrictive eating disorder. And, you know, like we're women and you're supposed to have a period once you enter the menarche, isn't it? Like when you're in puberty, when you hit puberty, and then it's like we're supposed to bleed every month. And, you know, it's a kind of an inconvenience. And then if it comes with pain and cramps and all of these things as well, you'd kind of think, geez, it would be nice if I didn't have to deal with that every month. But of course, there are side effects if we don't have a period regularly. What are those?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, right? And you're so right, because like people, I mean, yeah, everything you said, like I sign off on that, right? Like for many people, periods are often an inconvenience. But it's that case of like, you don't know what you have until it's gone, right? Like, so people might hate their period all their lives, and then it's missing and they're like, oh my gosh, I'd do anything to get it back, right? Because it's like a life sign. Sometimes called, I think there's a book or something that's called the fifth vital sign or something. And your period is a really good indicator of your like overall health. So yeah, I think it's a case of that. And yeah, I mean, some of the main long-term impacts of HA, of course, one is difficulty becoming pregnant. Obviously, not everyone who is missing their period wants to become pregnant, but that's like, I think one of the most common reasons that I'll have people getting in touch with me to work with me is because they want to become pregnant, or they know they want to become pregnant at some point and they want to get their period back. Also, just to note, some people aren't sure if you can still become pregnant if you have HA. You definitely, like most of the time, cannot become pregnant because you're not ovulating, right? So like the root cause of HA isn't really just that you're not bleeding, it's mostly that you're not ovulating. So that's kind of the root cause. Because yeah, I just wanted to
That's great to point that out as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer that question that you didn't ask. But I thought that was important because I think people often wonder that. So yeah, I mean, difficulty becoming pregnant because you're not ovulating. Really like chronically low energy, right? Like feeling like you've been hit by a bus by the time it comes to lunchtime, which is also really common when you're dieting and restricting. Really like long term, there can be an impact on your bone health because you need estrogen to maintain your bone health. And it's especially like risky to have HA before you turn 25 because, as you know, Lynn, your peak bone mass is put down when you're 25. So really up until you're 25, your bones are still growing and hardening, right? So like if you don't have estrogen cycling through you, when you're below 25, you're never putting down that peak bone mass, which is really just putting you at risk of things like osteoporosis later in life, which can lead to things like injuries, bone fractures. So bone health is a really big one. And I know that bone health, like, it's not really the like hot topic, right? But it is still really important because it impacts your quality of life. Another one, of course, like just really like low mood and feeling really low and mood swings, and also just feeling blah, right? And when we feel blah, your performance at school, work, in relationships, in life, all of these things suffer. And yeah, I think that's kind of the main ones. And I should also say, one of the paradoxes of HA is that people tend to be really health conscious when they have HA. And it's almost like they're maybe restricting food or restricting food groups in the name of health. But actually, long-term not having a period is like really like anti-health, right?
Yeah.
And there's also, it's really interesting that your cholesterol levels, people with HA often have really high cholesterol levels because estrogen is heart protective, right? And controls our estrogen level and controls our cholesterol. So people can tend to have high cholesterol and eventually heart disease, like if they don't have their period for like many years. So yeah, those are kind of the main ones. Hopefully I
Yeah.
kind of covered a bunch, and maybe there's some interesting ones
I
in there to
think
think about.
I think you did, and I think it's so. I mean, what you mentioned about bone health, it's one
Mhm.
of these things like when you are maybe in your 20s, you don't think about those things. It's like that seems so far off.
Mhm.
But it like you said, I think it's such a valid point to make that it can really impact your quality of life if your bone health is compromised. Like if you more easily get stress fracture, or I mean, we know that it is something that as we enter perimenopause and menopause, when we get older as women, that then that because of the lower levels of estrogen, then it can impact our bone health. And like if people have fractures like hip fractures and things like that, the healing is much slower, and it really has an impact of your quality of life. But like you wouldn't want to be having a hip fracture when you were 25, or
Yeah.
so it's those things. But that's probably lesser of a motivator
Mhm.
than getting your period back for fertility reasons, because that's what I've seen as well. Like even people in their early 20s, they're not necessarily thinking about starting a family right now, but if they're in a relationship or they're thinking about wanting to be in a relationship, it's like, well, I probably would want to have, and it starts to become a little bit of a concern that they don't have their period, or that it's very irregular and things like that. So that tends to be the stronger motivator to do something about it. But it's not something like the bone health isn't really kind of something, unless I suppose you end up with stress fractures from over exercising, and then yeah, that might show up then that there's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case for clients. Clients who want to work with me, most of the time it's fertility or I want to become pregnant at some point. And also there are like many people who maybe are over exercising and they have continuous injuries, or maybe they go to the GP or physio or something with recurring injuries or pain. And often I've had, people tell me that medics or other professionals will tell them, it's probably because you're exercising too much. And then it almost opens up a wormhole of, oh, now that someone's pointed this out, I kind of can't put a lid on this. And actually, I think I have problems with food and exercise and my relationship to my body. So yeah, I think that's an important point. Like with HA, often a trigger to seek support and to heal HA can come from like a lot of problems with injuries. So that happens a lot. Because almost when you have HA, you're like almost like high functioning, right? And you're always what's the word? Congratulated and encouraged to keep your behaviors up, right? Because it's like, oh, look how, healthy you are, or oh, you're like so motivated to run every day or something. But actually that person might not even realize they're struggling too much until something happens. And usually that could be an injury or a pain that like lasts for a long time that they need to seek help for. Because often it's not the missing period that makes people reach out for help. Usually it's been something else.
That's really interesting to know too. And like for anybody listening, maybe, thinking, actually, it's not a problem. I don't have my period. I haven't had it for years. I'm not too worried. And then, like you said, if you have an injury and then you can't exercise for a period of time, and that's often then where some of those things rear up, because the discomfort that comes from not being able to move in the way you're used to can then, I suppose, highlight lots of other things that might be going on, and how we're using exercise to, to deal with emotional challenges. The other thing that I want to circle back to, just to make a point, was what you said around if you have HA and low levels of, say, estrogen, and the connection with mood around that, because I just think it's so interesting, that intersection between hormone and mood.
Same. Yeah.
And again, that's like something to be aware of. I think because sometimes it's like people are feeling, and I see this now again, because my interest isn't in female hormones. I'm totally out of myself here in this this conversation. But I'm in my early 40s now, and there's more conversations around perimenopause and menopause, which is, of course, what we're talking about here. But the intersection again there with hormones and mood, and because the hormones are fluctuating, or there is not enough circulating, and the impact that has on mood. And I think just the awareness of this intersection can be helpful for people, I think, so that you get the right kind of support. Whether that's like, if the low mood is coming from a hormonal kind of root cause, then that's what needs to be addressed, versus going on SSRIs or something else, because it's not the right root cause, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're so right. Yeah, that's such a good point, because I know that root cause, I think it's a kind of buzzy term, right? Like, get to your root cause. But actually, yeah, I mean, if your root cause is like this chronic lack of hormones, like in HA, like, I don't know, I mean, maybe something like an SSRI or a medication might be helpful, but ultimately, I mean, also, and you can do both, right? You can be on an SSRI and heal your HA at the same time. But I think this is kind of what's the problem with healthcare, is the root cause isn't really explored. And actually, there's so many people who have HA and they just don't even know about it, because it's kind of like, oh, my period's a bit weird sometimes, like it goes missing for a year and then it comes back. But yeah, you're so right on the link between mood and hormones. That's so true.
Yeah, I think it's just something to be aware of, because there can be so many different factors that can be an underlying driver for the presenting symptoms. So you could have 10 people with similar symptoms, but they can all have different underlying causes that are driving those symptoms. And I suppose that's where, the challenge is for anybody working in a healthcare setting, is to ask enough questions to figure out, well, what is the underlying drivers or root causes for this particular person? And I think that's where I suppose what we're trying to do here in our conversation today is like highlighting some awareness around HA so that if your periods are kind of very irregular, or it's gone missing for months or years even, to be aware that, oh, this could be a thing, particularly if, you might feel like maybe I'm not eating enough, or maybe I'm restricting my food intake, or I'm actually exercising a lot. And the other question that I had as well, because, years ago they used to talk about, particular within athletes, so called the female triad. And then I think they changed it to red S.
Yeah.
And is red S and HA the same thing? Or like red S is relative energy deficiency syndrome, I think.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so I mean, HA is, I guess, more common in athletes, but I don't really work with too many athletes, so I don't really know from that side of things. Like, I'm not a sports nutritionist, but REDS is almost like a three-pronged thing, and HA is just one of the components. And then
Okay.
and then the other components are like low or limited performance, and then like disrupted mood or some sort of thing like that. So it's almost like a triangle, and HA is like one of the points. So I don't really, I mean, I've worked with people who are athletes, but I'm not a sports nutritionist. So I'm kind of working with just that one little point of the HA. Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, yeah, I just was curious, but yeah, that makes sense. Like the HA is the one point of that triangle, but it is quite, again, due to the factors that you've spoken about, like the overexercise and the limited food intake, which of course can be really common in athletes as well as your everyday person, then they're at potentially higher risk for HA. But any of us who are under eating and overexercising and creating that relative energy deficiency are then at higher risk for developing HA.
Yeah. Can I also clarify a couple of things?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I've got one. I've got two. Let me start with one, and then I'll do the second one, which is actually the most important one. So I wanted to mention, a lot of the time people think they have PCOS, but it's probably HA. I really wanted to mention that because it's really common. So PCOS, I don't know if you've covered PCOS on the podcast before.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so PCOS is another hormonal condition, which is very common. It's like 1 in 10 women will have PCOS, and it's basically a condition with irregular periods, irregular ovulation or missing ovulation, and has factors like a lot of testosterone. So things like being very hairy, insulin resistance. It's linked to type 2 diabetes. It's just another type of female health condition. It has a lot of similarities to HA, right? Especially the missing periods and ovulation. So a lot of the time people will go to the GP and they'll say, I have a missing period, and they will like automatically assume it's PCOS, but actually it's probably HA. So I just wanted to mention that because I think like it's important for people to go to the GP and really like say, okay, I don't think it's PCOS, I think it's HA. And you can know it's HA if you have like no period, and then you can know it's PCOS if you have like a very irregular period. So if your cycle is like very long, but eventually you get a period, you know it's PCOS. So I just wanted to mention that because
Thank you for that, because I think I
yeah.
was aware of it. And again, PCOS is also quite common in people who have disordered eating. That's what I have seen. And again, with the anovulation or the lack of ovulation, sometimes then, and the hormones being all over the place, that can then play into the mood side, which can exacerbate the eating stuff. But I think that's a really, really valid point. And what you said there, like how easy then the HA can be misdiagnosed with
Mm-hmm.
PCOS, and it's
Yeah,
not the same thing. And it
and
probably doesn't need the same support to
no,
heal
it
either.
doesn't. And it's especially tricky because, well, this is a whole other issue, but management of PCOS tends to be don't gain weight or eat differently or exercise more, all this kind of so-called lifestyle condition advice. And for HA, that's just going to amplify HA, right? So it's really important to, even just if someone is like, oh, I didn't even think of that and I thought I had PCOS, just Google PCOS versus HA and you'll get a bunch of information on how to go about deciphering between the two. So I think that's really important.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, of course. Oh, and
Then
then
your
my
other point.
my second point was actually about like under eating. So when I talk about under eating, I can kind of see people thinking, oh yeah, but I'm not under eating. I'm just kind of like being good. I'm just kind of being healthy. And they kind of think of under eating like, it's different for everyone, but like one meal a day, right? Or like not eating meals, only eating snacks. When I'm talking about under eating, I'm talking about all levels. And everyone's body has a different response to under eating. So for some people, under eating could technically be 3 meals and 3 snacks a day, right? But they've just kind of skimped. They're kind of skimping on oil or something, or they're skimping on fats, or they're sometimes skipping a meal, right? Like under eating doesn't need to just be eating very little food. It can actually be just eating less than you need. And then your body kind of goes into an energy deficit. An energy deficit is also what people are trying to do when they're trying to lose weight, right? If someone's on a meal plan or they're trying to eat so-called healthy or they're tracking calories, like that person is under eating and under fueling. So yeah, just wanted to name that because sometimes when we talk about under eating, people have different perceptions to like what we mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also a really, really important point. And when you were talking there, again, and especially if we're talking about HA in relation to under eating and over exercising. So like anybody who's exercising a lot, even if that's not for weight loss reasons, but for athletic reasons or training, that means you're going to have to eat more to make up for that energy expenditure in order to make sure you don't end up in this energy deficit place. So people are often then trying to, come at it from two different angles, and you'll end up in a much bigger energy deficits, which of course, as we've discussed now, have these implications on our menstruation cycle and ovulation and periods. So Shannon, if somebody came to you, and of course, this is a podcast conversation, so it's not individual nutritional advice, but some general guidance of what would the healing HA look like?
Yeah. Okay, so I really see it as a triangle, and at the bottom, there's stress management, and then the layer up is the food and nutrition side of things, and also the weight restoration part, if that's needed. And then going up, it's the more exercise modifications. And then the next part up is almost I call them like, well, they're kind of random things, right? But like things like supplements or regimes that they can engage in, right? Kind of like additional things. So I think it's always really important to start with like the stress management side, because that's ultimately what's driving HA and keeping it going. So that would be about, distraction techniques, coping skills, things like, and obviously this isn't applicable for everyone, but just kind of general self-care routines, boundaries, routines, the more kind of relaxation tools like meditation, mindfulness, but it can also even be like building permission to relax. So building permission to, I don't know, watch like a film on the weekend versus going for a run, right? Like all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The next part up would be the nutrition and food side of things. So the first point would be regular eating. So eating like every 3 to 4 hours minimum. Working up to 3 meals and 3 snacks a day, which is a lot harder than it sounds. You know, I have clients,
Absolutely.
yeah, like I have clients who I've been working with them for a year, right? And they're still not eating 3 meals and 3 snacks because it's just too hard, right? Or there's things that like happen and they just can't go through with it, right? So
Yeah.
eating enough, eating regularly. A big one is always having a carbohydrate and a fat with your meals. So I call it like a visible carb and a visible fat. So always like being able to look at your plate and see, this is my carbohydrate, this is my fat, and then protein as well, but less focus on protein because really the treatment of HA is to up your energy intake and reduce your stress. And that's why you want to have fats, because fats also, you need them to produce hormones. And then carbohydrates, this is for energy because you're in an energy deficit. And then, of course, you also need protein, but most of an emphasis on carbs and fat. Also, over time, I like to have people incorporate more fun foods. One, because I just don't think you can really recover from disordered eating on healthy foods, right? Like, I think that you need to have fun foods to really heal your relationship to food. And also, they add energy. And it also means that you can kind of deal with the mindset around food, and get back to like regular, truly like happy, healthy eating. And then, you know, exercise modifications. It would be looking at different types of exercise they could do. It would be about reducing the intensity of exercise, the amount of exercise. You know, I do a lot of work with my clients on really like giving themselves permission to rest. And with that, there tends to come up a lot about their like perceptions of what it means to be active or quote unquote like lazy.
Mm.
What can come up about, I don't know, like their parents' relationship to exercise, or like how exercise was treated when they were young, right? Like a lot of therapy work comes up all throughout HA. Like it's not just kind of like, I don't know, like I think I've seen like online a lot of like heal from HA plans, and it's like eat 3 meals a day, check. You know, eat 3 snacks a day, check. Stop running and do yoga, check. But actually, because HA is so disordered eating dominant, I think it really needs a lot of the like core work. The core work is in how you came to have HA, how you came to have disordered eating, what roots are in it. So throughout all of this is also the more therapeutic work, which is some of my fave work. And I think that's why I like HA so much and disordered eating in general. But yeah, I think HA can also be really fun to work with because it's also about like experiment with, you know, oh, how can I increase my energy and make food taste really good? So it would be like, you know, drizzling. I think there's such a freedom that actually encapsulates HA recovery. Like it's almost freedom building. It's having the full permission to say, I need more energy because my body is on hot red alert. So I'm going to drizzle olive oil on my pasta. I'm going to add cheese to everything. I'm going to add cream to hot chocolate, right? Like it's kind of this like really fun recovery model. Yeah, so that's kind of how I would go about healing from HA. But my 3 main tips would be stress management and really kind of like going full in with it, not just kind of like I'm gonna like try to meditate, like do something that feels good to you and makes you feel good. eating regular, so no more than like 3 to 4 hours between meals, and then also trying to rest a bit more. So if you're exercising every single day, try to have one rest day, or on that rest day, do some stretching or something instead. That would be my kind of start for people
I
to
think
go.
there is so much in that. And I
Yeah.
think looking at even, like you said, the 3 different parts of that triangle, yes, like even if we, I listed out and I link back to the blog that you wrote for my website as well with these things written down. But like you said, the work when you're working with a practitioner around healing HA is to also explore the barriers you're making these things happen, because in my experience as well, that's often the challenge, just because there's a reason why we ended up under eating and over exercising in the first place, and some of those things needs to be explored and unpacked and looked at, and then putting new things in place so that you can have this freedom of healing that you're talking about. And I find, like, for some of my clients, even the idea of taking like a rest day, it can take weeks to build up to the courage to be with the discomfort that takes, or explore the connotations around the word lazy and what that means, and what does it mean if I'm resting? Am I lazy? And if I am lazy, what does that mean? And all the stereotyping that goes with that. And there's so many things in that. So even though I think the healing that you describe is clear cut in one way, it's not easy necessarily to move that, and getting support around it, I think, can be really helpful for people to really make tractions then in their recovery.
Yeah, totally. And also another note on that is, like, I mean, it's like you said, it's definitely not easy to reduce exercise. But what is even harder is to reduce exercise and add other things. And like you said, to actually sit with the discomfort that comes up. Like, it's actually about an embodied approach to it, rather than, I call it like white knuckling, like white knuckling and forcing yourself to eat more or to move less, but actually to really sit with what comes up and to feel what happens in your body when you're doing these things is even harder, right?
Absolutely.
And I think like traditional disordered eating recovery is kind of almost pushing people away from connection to themselves. And so the way that I view things is like bringing people into more connection, which is really difficult, right? Because that can bring up a lot of other things. But it's about almost like giving up the white knuckling and really, really going for like long-term healing, rather than like, I don't know, there's almost this feeling sometimes where people are like, okay, I'll get my period back. But then once it's back, I'll immediately go back to eating a bit less. And the thing with HA is like, that doesn't work, because the body like really keeps tabs on you, and it's like, like, I know what you've done before. I'm not letting this happen again, right?
Yeah. And yeah, like what you said there as well, like going for the long-term healing rather than the white knuckling, because a lot of people actually who end up with disordered eating and eating disorder have, I think, more willpower than most people. So it's not a willpower issue then, and then using more willpower in form of like white knuckling to recovery there's probably times when some of that kind of determination is helpful, but overall moving towards embodiment and reconnecting with oneself is kind of like what's going to bring the long-term healing and sustained recovery from something like HA or even disordered eating in general.
Yeah, exactly.
One more question for you there, Shannon, before we bring this to a close, is that, I just also wanted to ask you, because people might think again, like that somebody who is vulnerable to develop HA might have a particular body type, like somebody who's already quite slim and then, become visibly underweight. But if somebody is in a bigger body, are they also at potential risks for HA if they're engaging in under eating and over exercising?
Oh, for sure, for sure. Anyone in any body size can have HA. And this is also why I wanted to talk about the PCOS versus HA thing, because really sadly, many people in bigger bodies or just not small bodies, many people will be told they have PCOS, or kind of assume that they have PCOS because they're in a bigger body. And so, yeah, people in all bodies have HA. And actually, there's quite a bit of research actually that shows that people who were in larger bodies and who engage in dieting, and then kind of maintain that weight that they became smaller at, because that's really stressful. And there's like a lot of disordered behaviors that go on there. Those people are actually people at really high risk of developing HA, because they're almost like in a very stressed, disordered place with food. I think that makes sense. You know what I mean, right?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes sense because you might have to engage in a lot of disordered behavior. Plus, you are probably chronically under eating and also over exercising in order to try to maintain this weight deficit that you have achieved. But if that's not where your body wants to be naturally, then yeah, that totally makes sense to me why somebody would then be prone to develop HA. So I think it's worth having that awareness too, that it's not just kind of stereotypically what people might think of what people look like that would have eating disorders or would develop eating disorders, but actually HA can happen to anyone in who is under eating and over exercising, regardless of body size, because it's relative, right, to what one's own body needs to function well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all body sizes, and all ages as well. I spoke to someone last week who's in their 60s, and they've basically like never had a period, right? Like HA is across all the sizes and all the ages. And it's a very
Wow.
yeah. Yeah, so
Yeah. And you'd wonder, like now at that age where you've sort of technically would have stopped ovulating anyway.
yeah.
Yeah. Like the potential side effects from a long-term HA undiagnosed and untreated probably has put that person in a more precarious place than they need to be. So that's a bit sad.
Yeah.
But she's lucky she's connected with you. So that is a good thing.
Yeah.
So Shannon, I always ask all my questions this, what joyful nourishment mean to them? So what does joyful nourishment mean to you?
I think mine's is just freedom. So freedom to eat what you want, freedom to connect with your body, freedom to have a connection to your body and the world, and to feel nourished enough that you can go about the world and meet new people and eat new foods. And honestly, I think it's just freedom. I know that like we say food freedom and it's a kind of buzzy word, but I do think that that's what it means. Just having just being relaxed around food, because honestly there's so many more things to worry about than food in this life, right? Like, and I think that joyful nourishment means that to me. I think it means freedom and to see food as just food, but also for it to be enjoyment.
Yeah, I love that. Joyful nourishment, freedom as a joyful nourishment. Yeah, I love that. That feels really, really expansive.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this conversation, Shannon. I think it's been really helpful to shed some more light what HA is, why it's common for people who might have disordered eating or an eating disorder, some of the side effects if we don't have periods for long periods of time, and also for your guidance of the work that can be done to actually heal this. So where can people find more about you and your work, and if they want to connect with you further?
Thanks for having me on, and I agree, it was really lovely. Instagram, ease_nutrition therapy, website, easenutritiontherapy.com, or you can just search my name and these things will come up on Google. Just my full name, Shannon Western. I have a podcast as well. It's called the Ease with Food podcast. I talk about HA quite a bit. So yeah, that's how they can find me.
Brilliant. And I will link to all of that in the show notes. Thanks again, Shannon, for being part of the Joyful Nourishment podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com, and if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.